Persona is a massive franchise. I mean, just look at it. For what's considered a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei, the fact it's been able to surpass its popularity is still something that amazes me to this day. However, it wasn't always like this. Before the days of multi-platform releases, Persona has always been a very weird franchise. Many say that it was a PlayStation exclusive for the longest time, and for the mainline games it was. But then you'd have games like Persona Q on the 3DS and Arena on the Xbox 360. So to say that this franchise has always been consistent with what platform it chooses to be in, that's just a blatant lie. This in itself can be somewhat a good idea on paper. Sure, the other platforms aren't getting Persona 5, but hey, at least we have Strikers on the Switch. It has the worst loading times in existence, but it works. However, this, in my opinion, only causes more harm than good for the brand. Whatever the case may be, what matters now is that those days are long gone. We finally have every new Persona game releasing on almost all mainstream platforms. This is beyond a positive. Not only does the brand have its cohesion, but it's even more accessible than ever. And hey, it seems like it all worked out in the end. This did leave me wondering though, what are we going to do with the previous releases the franchise has made? Of course, we have P3 to P5 ported, those are after all the big money makers. Though I can't stop to think about some very particular games that have yet to be given a second chance. Why is this? Well, that's what I'm here to discuss. I'm going to look over a handful of Persona projects that have yet to see a proper remaster, re-release, or remake, explain a bit of what they're about and their chances of seeing the light of day again. With that said, let's see what we have in store for us. These are the Persona games that are trapped on dead consoles. And again, before we start, I just want to say that if you're enjoying our productions, or you want to see more Persona-related stuff from us, be sure to press that subscribe button. And while you're at it, be sure to check out our Patreon to further grow the channel. Let's start with a little handheld duology. Persona Q and Q2 are without a doubt the most popular games that'll be featured on this list. For those unaware, this is a sub-series of the Persona franchise with both games released on the Nintendo 3DS. The story for these two is as simple as it can get. We have some big bad causing some strange events, so it's up to the protagonist to stop the one behind it. Notice how I said protagonists, plural. Yeah, so as you can tell, the big reason that these games are so popular is through the use of its fan service. The plot is really not much other than a reason to have these characters be able to meet with one another. This kind of direction in a game can feel like a cheap tactic in most cases, but back when Q released, this was definitely quite a novelty. Not only that, but Persona Q and Q2 do a pretty good job at handling the characterization of the casts. It's nothing crazy or perfect. After all, they're having to write over 20 characters in Q2. I don't expect them to be as well written as their mainline counterparts, but even then, it's just fun to see these characters together. You get to see fun interactions you'd probably never think that would work. That's not even mentioning the art style. I absolutely love the chibi approach in it. It just helps with the kind of tone the game wants to have, with it being a lot more laid back and almost cartoony. The gameplay is overall, as many call it, Etrian Odyssey with a Persona theme. For those who don't know, Etrian Odyssey is another franchise published by Atlus. The way it works is like your typical dungeon crawler. What's a little interesting, however, is as you explore, you can fill in your own map using different symbols and notes provided from the game. It may sound like a slog, but from what I hear and played from Q2, it's very entertaining. It definitely feels like an old school RPG with some unique twists. Despite being a dungeon crawler, the environments are incredibly fun and colorful too. All the same mechanics and logic apply to the Q games. You're pretty much just going around fighting enemies while exploring new areas to proceed the story. My only experience with these games was playing Q2 because, get this was my first Persona game. Believe me, back in 2019 I was absolutely desperate to play anything that resembled a Persona game. The only consoles I had at the time was my Switch and a 3DS. And what do you know, Persona Q2's release is just around the corner. As someone who understood both P4 and P5 story, it was super enjoyable. I only played a brief amount for this production, but it's as fun and charming as I remember it being. Obviously the magic isn't the same as it was, because look at me. But despite all that, there really is a lot to love in this series. Now the real question becomes, why hasn't Atlus ported these games yet? They have their fans, and it's Persona, so it must mean anyone will buy them, right? Well, this is where things get a bit shaky. Q2, for whatever reason, was released at around the summer of 2019. Nothing wrong with that, but this was for the 3DS. The Nintendo Switch was practically thriving with Smash Ultimate and so many of its other releases. By this point in time, people who had a 3DS either didn't care, didn't want to go through the trouble of buying it, or simply didn't have a 3DS. This as a result caused the game to sell about a third of what its predecessor did. However, it seems like Atlus knew this, considering the game doesn't even have an English dub. I feel like they mainly released it just so they could get whatever little revenue they could at the time. And maybe also for Persona fans like me. So does this mean the game has any chance of being re-released? Well, not entirely. You see, back around June of 2023, Etrian Odyssey had a collection of its first 3 games released. And wow, they actually did the unthinkable. They somehow managed to implement the fact this game needed 2 screens to even work. Though I know you may be asking, did these games even sell well in the first place? Well, no. The games did pretty poorly, all things considered. The fact the full collection was being marketed at $80 didn't help much either. However, I'd like to argue that there is a little hope for this game. Keep in mind we're comparing 2 completely different games here. While Q has the exact same dungeon mechanics as Odyssey, Atlas most likely had very different expectations for their sales. Plus, Q and Q2 are widely regarded as very fun spin-offs within the community. If anything, now's the perfect time to get these games out. The Persona fandom is bigger than it's ever been thanks to Joker's inclusion in Smash, and it shows that they've capitalized on that success as much as they possibly could. Now, in a time when we finally have the big 3 Persona games on every platform, why not double dip and use that to your advantage? This is what I mean that it's always been so weird for Atlus to be making these spin-offs on different platforms. For that reason alone, hopefully around Persona's 30th anniversary or so, we get some sort of announcement or potential release regarding the matter. Though as of now, I'll give the Persona Q games a 2 out of 5 chance of being re-released, mainly since a lot of my arguments have little information to be backed up from. Now, why don't we talk about a collection of 3 games that not only deserve to be released, but also need a new coat of paint. So why not take a small detour from spin-offs and talk about... Yes, I know the chances of these games getting a remake are insanely high due to a specific leak. However, it's one thing to say that they'll get a remake, but what exactly is going to be remade? For the purposes of this production, P1 and P2 are still technically on a dead console, which is why I included it here. In that case, let's give a brief introduction. Persona 1 and 2's duology are definitely the most interesting part of the mainline series. We made some reviews in regards to the specifics of these 2 titles, so be sure to check them out after this production. Let's start with Persona 1. It's definitely one of the least enjoyed Persona titles within the fandom, and honestly, I completely understand why. We touched upon it in our review, but my god is the gameplay a chore to get through. The thing you need to understand is that unlike their younger sibling counterparts, P1 plays like the kind of JRPG you'd see around this time. Multiple encounters, clunky controls, dialogue being the only way to know where to go, and as a whole, it's just a very challenging game to play, and not in a good way. There's a big reason we only talk about 7th gen games and later, and this one demonstrates my frustrations proudly. Now, am I saying that it's a completely bad game? No, not in the slightest. I loved Persona 1. For a bit of context, I started my playthrough of P1 back in 2020. This was back in my desperate Persona fan era, where I pretty much had no options to play the modern games. However, I was somehow able to play P1, and it was an absolute joy to see how the series actually started. The story was really good too. One of its plots revolve around learning more about one of our classmates, Maki, who, in a way, her mind and memories have been twisted into reality because of our big bad Kandori. The game just has this ominous and lonely tone that none of the other games were able to replicate. Not even P2 could do it. It's a weird feeling, but P1, for being the most disliked and quote-unquote black sheep of the franchise, is what ultimately made me enjoy it a lot more. It feels mysterious and eerie, but it was charming and like I was discovering a diamond in the rough. Is the story perfect? No, not really. It does have very basic characters and some you rarely see. But the tone in the characters we do get to see really enhances a lot of the experience. Oh, and if you thought Persona 1 was okay, wait till I talk about the duology that is Persona 2. I say duology because, get this, the story was so ambitious they had to make 2 completely different games in the same timeline, those being Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment. I loved Innocent Sin. The story was absolutely insane with itself. We went from fighting some group of evil people to exploring ancient Mayan ruins, and the next thing you know, we're fighting aliens. It's such a joy and it's crazy how it all masterfully works. The characters too, oh my gosh, they're so good. I can seriously go on and on about how awesome this game here is. Eternal Punishment was just as good too. Between the 2, I still prefer Innocent Sin, but this one here feels much more mature and is grand-scaled. It follows up on the events of what happened in Innocent Sin, but this time instead of having the cast from the game you have a whole new one, all being adults too. Which is amazing. That's not even mentioning how good a lot of them were. Sadly, the same problems I had with Persona 1 and its tedious gameplay also applies to this one. If anything, it's even worse. You have this rumor system where you can spread misinformation and get an advantage like new weapons and items. It's a really nice concept, but I was so confused on how to properly use it. Fusing personas here also feels inferior compared to P1. So the thing about fusing personas is you pretty much had to do it by having 2 different demons combined into one. Simple, right? Well, what if I told you that the way you had to do it in both P1 and P2 was gathering all these skill cards and having enough to actually make a new persona? And the main way you'd get them is by talking and negotiating with the demons. Keep in mind, you need a lot of cards to make something. There's different kinds too, so it just adds more of a hassle. And as you can tell, it wasn't very fun. Now, why am I saying all this? Well, this is just a bit more context on what it actually felt like playing these games. I want to just say, Atlus, please just give these games the Persona 5 treatment. It'll do so much better for everyone. I get these games have a charm, and people do like these old school JRPG mechanics, but my god, even after playing them, I don't think I could ever go back. Not even Persona fans enjoy them as much due to the gameplay. That's why I'd at least want to say that for all the reasons I listed here, Persona 1 and 2 having a similar direction and structure like 3, 4, and especially 5 will benefit them in the long run. There's a lot of ways they can do this too. Give them their own unique menus, similar battle mechanics, while also implementing what worked in the originals, make each of the locations/dungeons uniquely designed, and so much more. Will this cause controversy in the community? Oh, easily. I mean, have you seen how people reacted after hearing Reload was made in the Unreal Engine? This will easily get fans to actually respect these games and give them the love they deserve. Persona 1 and 2 already have about a 4 out of 5 chance of being ported, so for my ideas and suggestions, I'll give it a 3 out of 5 that they'll remake them with that in mind. Now, with all that in mind, the last game I want to talk about is probably the one I want to see come back the most. Though this might also be one of the most polarizing games in the franchise. I'm talking of none other than... Wow, we're finally talking about it. So for those unaware, back before Persona 5 released, Persona 4 was pretty much inescapable. The amount of spin-offs and milking it got in such a short period is always so fascinating to me. Even if I've never been a fan around this time, I can't imagine how amazing it would feel getting this many spin-offs all of a sudden. We got things like Persona 4 Arena, Golden's re-released, and 2 full anime series, all within the span of 3 to 4 years. Now, within all this milking that Atlus was doing, there was one particular game that released. It was ultimately the second spin-off and the last experiment in Persona 4's lifespan. Persona 4 Dancing is like Persona 1, a very mysterious yet fascinating game. In a time where people were absolutely tired of Persona 4 and just wanted to see what 5 was all about, they still managed to release this last project. Of all the titles featured on here, this is easily the one I want to make a review for the most. So the story is, in the best way to put it, it feels like a return to form. Dancing specifically is a mystery revolving around this one group that works with Rise named Kanamin Kitchen. There's a ton of suspense and the story even goes borderline dark with its imagery and its message. It's almost a reflection of what it truly is like in the idol industry in Japan, and that's really, really cool. One thing I didn't enjoy as much in Arena's story is that they had to balance out not only the investigation team, but also a bunch of new characters and the cast of Persona 3's older characters. This only made the game's plot convoluted and borderline unfocused to me. In Dancing, however, all of those problems are gone. Not only is the investigation team back in the main spotlight, they're much older and experienced in figuring out the mystery. Considering this is the last proper sequel these characters get, this is a very nice way to wrap them up. The gameplay is just a typical rhythm game. You play notes on the beat of the music and get the best score. There's also a full shop to buy items and a ton of costumes too, and that's not even mentioning how good the music is here. But for now, the big question is this game ever going to get ported? Sadly, I have the least faith on this one. At least with the Persona Q games, we've seen that Atlus can port over 3DS games, and with how popular the series is, it does have a bigger chance. This one though, it's very unlikely. All because of this garbage here. Are Persona 3 and 5 Dancing terrible games? No, there's a game better suited for that title after all. However, these two games really could have done something very special, but it was all ruined due to how scummy the whole foundation was. The best way to describe these two games is like if Atlus tried to copy the same strategy Pokemon does with releasing 2 games, except this time they have even less content and over 50% of it needs to be bought as DLC. As you can tell, this did not sit well with people, and in the end, these games absolutely flopped. The whole stigma behind them is also very negative. Many people, like I said, don't hate them, it's just enough of a failed experiment that I don't see Atlus trying to replicate. What hurts is that Persona 4 Dancing was never that. I can tell it had a lot of passion and love put into it. They likely knew this would be the last spin-off for these characters, so they made sure to go all out on it. I respect that, and that's why I mainly want P4 deported. Though, like I said, due to the disaster that was these 2 games, the future for the Dancing series is very complicated, to say the least. Who knows, maybe they could come back. I'd love to be wrong. Honestly, the only way they could feasibly sell these games is making a full collection of them for full price. But even then, I don't see that happening. I'm giving Persona 4 Dancing a 1 out of 5 chance of being re-released. The full collection I mentioned with 3 and 5 and their DLC, probably half of that to almost 0 chance. I didn't want to end this production on such a sad note, so let me just say this. There's really no telling what could happen to these games. I may say that the chances of them are slim to none, but this is Atlus we're talking about. Just when you think that we will never give any more attention to their other franchises, here they are trying new things and seeing what works. To me, Atlus is a bit like Nintendo in how unpredictable they can be sometimes. Just back in 2019, people thought Persona would be the only thing they cared for now, and what do you know? 2 years later, we get Shin Megami Tensei 5. With a full new campaign of it coming just around the corner, my best advice is to simply be patient and keep having hope for what you wish from them. There's definitely going to be games where there's practically zero chance of getting a sequel or any project again, but there will be just as many games that have a lot of potential to be back, and even more projects along the way. This was definitely a fun way to go back on memory lane though. In a time where every new Atlus release is now going to be made in every possible platform, it's always exciting to see what's going to be their next step, and I'll be sure to follow them on whatever step they take. But I hope they can still make a TMS sequel though, that would be great.